It was supposed to be an ordinary October morning in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire. A small, peaceful town where people still left their doors unlocked and waved to each other on their morning walks. But on the 4th of October, 2009, a savage act of violence shattered that illusion forever. Inside a quiet home on Trow Road, a mother was butchered, and her young daughter left clinging to life, all for no reason other than someone's twisted desire to kill. Welcome to Mystery Unveiled. Thank you, my viewers. A special thank you to our loyal subscribers for joining us as we uncover the darkest, most gripping true crime stories every single day. Your support fuels our mission to bring you both infamous cases and chilling untold mysteries. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. That someone was 17-year-old Steven Spader. This is the story of a boy who was adopted into love, grew up in privilege, and descended into the darkest corners of human cruelty. This is the story of how a teenager formed a so-called club with one mission: to kill. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of New Hampshire's most horrifying crimes, the murder that shook an entire state, and the mind behind it. Steven Spader was born on the 8th of March, 1991. Just days after his birth, he was adopted by a loving couple, Joseph and Tamara Spader. They brought him home to Brookline, New Hampshire, a small wooded town just outside Nashua. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where Steven seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. Joe and Tamara Spader were hardworking and devoted. They loved Steven deeply, and they spared no effort in giving him everything a child could need: stability, education, affection, and structure. By all accounts, Steven was their world, their only child. But from an early age, something in Steven seemed different. Even in elementary school, Steven displayed signs of detachment. Teachers described him as intelligent, but impulsive. He was quick to anger and slow to show remorse. He was disruptive in class and had difficulty with authority. But like many children with behavioral problems, his outbursts were initially chalked up to normal adolescent rebellion. By the time Steven entered high school, the behavioral problems had escalated. He began skipping class, hanging out with kids his parents didn't approve of, and showing signs of defiance at home. He became obsessed with violent media horror movies, crime documentaries, and later, materials that glorified serial killers. At first, Joe and Tamara tried the standard parental routes: therapy, counseling, open communication. When those efforts failed, they turned to more serious interventions. In May 2008, when Steven was 17, his parents enrolled him in the Adirondack Leadership Expeditions program in Saranac Lake, New York. The program was not cheap, $500 a day, but the Spaders were willing to do whatever it took to save their son. The facility specialized in helping troubled teens through outdoor therapy and character development. But Steven didn't last 2 weeks. According to court documents, counselors at the Adirondack facility noted that Steven's behavior was volatile. He would stab at countertops with knives and throw food during outbursts. One counselor described him as a house of cards: unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. The staff concluded they weren't equipped to manage Steven's behavior. He needed a more intensive level of care. So he was escorted directly to another facility, the Aspen Education Residential Treatment Center in Syracuse, Utah. This program cost $9,000 a month, and again, insurance didn't cover it. The Spaders footed the bill out of pocket. But Steven didn't last long there either. Less than a month into the program, he was out. His parents were running out of options and time. Steven returned home, but he wasn't the same. His behavior grew darker. He became fascinated by control, violence, and power. His journals, later discovered by police, were filled with fantasies of torture and domination. He began referring to himself by names like the Duke and Leader, and started talking to peers about forming a club, one that would glorify crime and mayhem. The club would eventually be called the Disciples of Destruction, or DOD. Its purpose? To commit violent crimes and, ultimately, murder as a form of initiation. This wasn't just talk. Steven meant every word. In June 2010, months after the brutal murder he orchestrated, Steven underwent a psychological evaluation with Dr. David Kincherf, a forensic psychologist. The results were disturbing, but not surprising. Kincherf wrote that he found no major mental illness in Steven, no bipolar disorder, no schizophrenia, no psychosis. But what he did observe were chilling personality traits. He noted clear evidence of narcissistic traits, a grandiose sense of self, lack of empathy, and a craving for admiration. There were also borderline personality disorder trails: impulsivity, unstable relationships, and emotional instability. And perhaps most disturbing of all, Kincherf observed clear signs of antisocial and asocial behavior, traits that align closely with what is commonly known as antisocial personality disorder, a condition often linked with sociopathy. Despite being untreated for mental illness during his time in prison, Steven never exhibited any major mood disorders like depression or mania. That, Kinshirf wrote, was telling. It would be very unusual for an individual diagnosed in mid-adolescence with recurrent major depression or bipolar disorder to subsequently show no clear manifestation of mood disorder while untreated over a period of many months to years, he stated. In other words, Steven Spader didn't have a mood disorder. He had a cold, calculating, remorseless personality. In a deposition following Steven's conviction, Senior Assistant Attorney General Jeff Strelzin asked Joseph Spader what he wished the judge would consider about his son. Joe's response wasn't a defense. It wasn't a plea for leniency. It was an indictment of the system. "You know, certainly the crime is just beyond the scope of my imagination," Joe said. "I mean, I feel for the families. But obviously we've tried to do a lot of stuff in the mental health area here in New Hampshire, and it's been a serious letdown. It's just appalling how poor it is here in this state." Just absolutely appalling. Joe Spader's voice broke as he spoke. "And you know, we've tried to do what we can. Could we have done more? I don't know." That's a question I keep asking myself. It's a question no parent ever wants to have to answer, especially when their child becomes a killer. Steven Spader's descent into darkness wasn't just a story of one disturbed young man. It was a tale of a family trying everything to help him and watching helplessly as he slipped away. But what happened next was worse than anyone could have imagined. Of October 2009. The night Steven Spader and his disciples committed one of the most brutal home invasions in New Hampshire history. Steven Spader wanted to know what it felt like to kill. He wanted to be feared, to be remembered, and he wasn't going to do it alone. On a quiet fall night in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, he got what he wanted. By the summer of 2009, Steven Spader had fully embraced his dark persona. He was no longer just a rebellious teenager. He was the self-appointed leader of a newly formed group, the Disciples of Destruction, or DOD. To outsiders, it might have looked like a joke, a group of angsty teens playing pretend. But to those inside it, DOD was deadly serious. Members were recruited based on loyalty and willingness to commit acts of violence. There was no hazing, no games. Just this one terrifying rule. To be initiated, you had to break the law. The more extreme, the better. Spader's inner circle included Christopher Gribble, 19, a homeschooled, intelligent but emotionally detached young man. Gribble had dreams of becoming a hitman and expressed no empathy toward others. He was Spader's perfect partner. Two younger teens, William Marks, 18, and Quinn Glover, 17, were pulled in as well. They weren't as deeply involved in the group's ideology, but they were there. And on the night of the 4th of October, they followed Spader and Gribble into hell. The plan was simple. Pick a house at random, break in, kill whoever was inside. Steven Spader believed that committing a random murder would make it more exciting and harder for police to track. He didn't want a motive. He didn't want a connection. He wanted chaos. The group scouted homes in Mount Vernon, a quiet, rural town nestled in southern New Hampshire. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by real crime. People left doors unlocked. Kids rode their bikes until sunset. It was, in Spader's eyes, the perfect hunting ground. They eventually chose a house on Trow Road. It sat quietly behind some trees. No barking dogs, no obvious alarm systems. Just a mother and daughter, living peacefully, completely unaware that 4 young men were watching them. The targets, 42-year-old Kimberly Cates and her 11-year-old daughter Jamie. It was around 4 a.m. when they struck. Spader, Gribble, Marks, and Glover dressed in dark clothing and parked nearby. They armed themselves with a machete, a knife, and a small sawed-off bat. Spader carried the machete. They entered the house through an unlocked door, quietly, cautiously, step by step through the darkened kitchen and hallway until they reached the master bedroom. Kimberly Cates was sleeping. So was her daughter. Spader raised the machete and brought it down with full force. The first blow landed on Kimberly's head. She screamed. The sound pierced the silence, but it was too late. Gribble joined in with his knife. Together, they stabbed and hacked at Kimberly dozens of times. The autopsy would later reveal that she suffered multiple chop wounds to the head, chest, and torso. The attack was swift, brutal, and frenzied. Jamie Cates woke up during the assault. Her mother's scream shook her awake, and then the pain began. Spader and Gribble turned their weapons on her next. She was just 11. They slashed at her head, her legs, her chest. She tried to fight back, tried to scream. But she was no match for 2 teenage boys armed with blades. She was left for dead, bleeding, broken, barely breathing. Spader, Gribble, Marks, and Glover ransacked the house, stole a few valuables including a pink iPod and a jewelry box, and left as calmly as they came. But Jamie Cates didn't die. Somehow, through sheer willpower and instinct, she pulled herself out of bed, covered in blood. Her mother's body lay next to her lifeless. She stumbled down the hallway, every step a miracle. She reached the phone and called the police. Her voice, trembling, was barely audible. "I need help," she whispered. The dispatcher stayed on the line, keeping her calm until help arrived. When emergency responders reached the house, what they found shocked even the most hardened officers. Blood covered the walls, the sheets, the floor. Kimberly Cates was declared dead at the scene. Jamie was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She had suffered multiple life-threatening wounds, but she would survive. She would become the living witness to a nightmare that stunned the nation. Police were baffled. There were no obvious enemies, no signs of personal motive, just a savage, senseless home invasion. But they didn't have to wait long. Within days, tips started rolling in. Word had spread among local teens that something terrible had happened, and that someone named Steven Spader had bragged about it. Investigators quickly zeroed in on him. He and Christopher Gribble were arrested, followed by Marks and Glover. In the interviews, the truth came spilling out, and it was darker than anyone imagined. When police searched Spader's belongings, they found a journal. Inside were chilling entries. "I'm a sociopath. I have no remorse for what I've done. I wanted to kill. I wanted to feel what it's like. It was the most thrilling night of my life." He described the attack in gruesome detail, noting how the machete sliced through her like a hot knife through butter. He didn't write with fear or guilt. He wrote with pride. Gribble was just as disturbing. In his confession, he said he considered raping the young girl before deciding it wasn't worth it. He spoke of the attack as if it were a game. Both young men exhibited zero empathy. No sorrow, no humanity. This wasn't just a killing. It was cold-blooded murder, carried out by teenagers for sport. 4 boys entered a home on a quiet street that night, but only 2 of them did the killing. The other 2, William Marks and Quinn Glover, had stayed in the shadows during the murder. They didn't swing weapons, but they also didn't stop it. What would justice look like for them? And would Steven Spader ever feel the weight of what he had done? When news of the Mount Vernon murder broke, it shocked not just New Hampshire, but the nation. Kimberly Cates was the definition of a beloved community member kind, devoted to her family and full of life. Her death felt personal to everyone. And the fact that her daughter had survived, despite catastrophic injuries, turned grief into resolve. Residents placed candles and flowers outside the home. Vigils were held. People locked their doors at night for the first time in years. Mount Vernon was no longer a small, sleepy town. It had become the site of one of the most gruesome crimes in New England history. Just days after the attack, the case cracked open. 2 local teens came forward to police. They had heard something disturbing from Steven Spader himself, a confession, not just about the crime, but boasting about it. Spader had reportedly shown the pink iPod he stole and talked about how cool the murder felt. He wasn't hiding it. He wanted recognition. Police quickly got a warrant. Spader and Gribble were arrested within days. Investigators seized Spader's notebooks, electronics, and clothing. What they found was bone-chilling. Steven Spader documented the crime like a trophy hunter. In his journal, he referred to the group as Dodd and described the plan to break into a house and kill the occupants just for fun. He detailed the weapons, the timing, and the feeling of the machete hitting flesh. Detectives couldn't believe what they were reading. There was no remorse, no fear, just pride. Spader wanted to be remembered, and his word would seal his fate. During interrogation, Christopher Gribble cracked. He told investigators everything with a cold, emotionless voice. He laid out how they entered the house, how Spader began attacking Kimberly first, and how he joined in. Gribble said he didn't feel anything. No fear, no guilt, nothing. And most disturbingly, he admitted he considered raping the 11-year-old girl but decided not to, because he didn't want to risk getting caught. "I guess I just didn't care enough," he said. Spader, on the other hand, refused to confess at first. He was cocky, calculated. But the evidence was overwhelming. Blood on his clothing, items taken from the house, and Gribble's full confession. Eventually, Spader stopped talking to police, but it didn't matter. They had enough. William Marks and Quinn Glover weren't directly involved in the murders, but they were there. They admitted to being in the house. Glover even described hearing the screaming and knowing what was happening. Both claimed they didn't know Spader would actually kill anyone, but they never called for help, never tried to stop it. They watched and walked away. Prosecutors decided to charge all 4. By the time the trial began in 2010, Jamie Cates had undergone multiple surgeries. She was now 12, stronger. But the trauma was permanent. She bravely took the stand to face the man who had tried to kill her. "I remember him standing over me," she told the courtroom, her voice steady. "I remember the machete." Her testimony was clear, emotional, devastating. Steven Spader sat just feet away from her. He never looked at her. Gribble, too, heard her describe the attack, but neither man showed emotion. The prosecution painted Spader as the mastermind, a cold-blooded killer who wanted to feel powerful. They showed the journal, the weapon, and his casual bragging after the crime. The defense tried to claim Spader was mentally ill, that he had deep-seated personality disorders, and lacked the ability to fully understand the consequences of his actions. But Dr. Kinshirf, a forensic psychologist who examined Spader, wasn't convinced. "I saw no major mental illness. He showed narcissistic antisocial traits, but he understood what he was doing," Kinshirf testified. Spader never took the stand. But he smiled. He laughed with his lawyers. He even made jokes during the proceedings. The jury took less than a day. Verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 76 years for attempted murder, conspiracy, and burglary. Gribble pled not guilty by reason of insanity. He claimed he had no conscience, that he couldn't feel, that he was wired differently. But his calm, calculated behavior during and after the crime didn't support his claim. Psychologists testified that Gribble knew right from wrong, that he chose to participate, that he bragged afterward. Jamie's testimony again played a major role. Verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. He too received life without parole, plus additional decades for other charges. William Marks and Quinn Glover agreed to plea deals. They admitted to being accessories to the murder and testified against Spader and Gribble. Marks was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. Glover received 20 to 40 years. Neither man would be eligible for parole for at least 2 decades. Jamie Cates survived 18 stab wounds to her face, chest, legs, and arms. She had to learn to walk again, to sleep without nightmares, to feel safe. Her survival was nothing short of miraculous. She became a symbol of resilience in New Hampshire. And in a rare public statement, she said, "I lived. And that means I get to tell my story. I get to fight for my mom. And I get to grow up something they tried to take away from me." Steven Spader was adopted as a baby. His parents, single childless professionals, did everything they could to raise him right. As he began spiraling out of control in his teens, drugs, violence, defiance, they tried everything. Wilderness therapy programs, residential treatment centers, private counselors. They spent thousands. Nothing worked. In court, his father testified, "We tried to help him. We begged for help from the state. The mental health system failed us." His mother echoed the same. Guilt, confusion, and deep heartbreak. "We don't know where we went wrong, but we never expected this." Steven Spader wanted to be famous. He wanted his name remembered. And it will be not as a leader, not as a visionary, but as a monster. A teenager who turned fantasy into horror. A child who became a killer. But even monsters don't win, because in Mount Vernon, the name that echoes louder than any other is Jamie. Steven Spader was sent to the New Hampshire State Prison for Men in Concord. From the very beginning, he remained defiant. While most convicts keep their heads down and try to adapt, Spader craved attention. He made headlines just months into his sentence by sending letters to local media, claiming that killing Kimberly Cates had made him feel empowered and that he thrived on causing pain. Authorities placed him in solitary confinement, both to protect other inmates and in hopes of limiting his exposure. He had become a dark symbol, not just a killer, but someone who celebrated what he had done. But Spader wasn't done disrupting lives. In 2011, a letter written by Spader was leaked to the media. It was addressed to another inmate and filled with boastful, chilling language. "I've always known I was different. I've never felt remorse. I've never felt guilt. I just don't have it in me." He went on to say that he enjoyed the attention his crime had brought him, that people finally knew who he was. This wasn't the behavior of someone seeking redemption. This was the voice of someone reveling in his identity as a killer. Meanwhile, Christopher Gribble settled into prison with a different demeanor. Unlike Spader, he seemed calm, even helpful. He joined Bible study groups, took educational programs, and appeared to take on a reformed image, but many questioned his sincerity. Gribble had shown no emotion during his trial, no regret. And while he later expressed some remorse in interviews and letters, prosecutors, psychologists, and even fellow inmates questioned if it was just another performance. He too was placed under strict watch, though not as isolated as Spader. Spader's legal team attempted to appeal his life sentence, citing his age at the time of the crime, just 17, and referencing the U.S. Supreme Court's 2012 ruling in Miller v. Wind, Alabama, which deemed mandatory life without parole for juveniles unconstitutional. But Spader's sentence wasn't mandatory. It was discretionary, given after careful judicial review, and given the sheer brutality of the crime, the New Hampshire Supreme Court upheld the sentence. In 2014, Spader made a surprising move, He petitioned to withdraw all future appeals. He told the court he wanted to accept his punishment, and that continued litigation was only reopening wounds for the Cates family. He was done fighting, at least in court. Gribble's appeals were also rejected. His insanity defense had failed, and the court stood by the verdict. Jamie Cates continued her road to recovery. Her physical injuries healed slowly, but the emotional scars ran deeper. For years, she suffered from PTSD, anxiety, and severe trauma. Sleep didn't come easily. Trust was hard to rebuild. But Jamie refused to live in fear. She returned to school, participated in sports, even took up public speaking, sharing her story of survival, healing, and hope. In 2013, she received the Courage Award from a national victims advocacy group. Her father, David Cates, became a vocal advocate for victims' rights and mental health reform. He pushed for tougher sentencing laws and better support for survivors. "You can either be consumed by grief," he once said in an interview, "or you can fight." And we chose to fight. The Cates case had a seismic impact on New Hampshire's legal system. In 2011, the Kimberly Cates Victim Assistance Fund was created to help survivors of violent crimes pay for counseling, medical treatment, and relocation. The state also reevaluated its juvenile sentencing laws, making it harder for young offenders involved in violent crimes to claim leniency solely based on age. A law known as Jamie's Law was proposed, requiring mental health evaluations for all juvenile offenders accused of felonies, a direct response to the system's failure to identify Spader's risk before he killed. The other two teens involved, Marks and Glover, quietly disappeared into the prison system. Their roles in the murder were less hands-on, but their inaction led to a woman's death and a child's near murder. William Marks reportedly struggled in prison. He had a hard time adjusting, often clashing with other inmates. He expressed regret in a 2015 interview, saying, "I should have stopped it. I could have. I'll live with that forever." Quinn Glover largely stayed under the radar. He focused on getting his GED and said little publicly after sentencing. Both men are still serving their decades-long sentences, with earliest parole possible in the 2030s. Mount Vernon changed. Residents began locking doors. Security systems went up, and for years the Cates home sat empty, a grim reminder of what had happened. Eventually, the house was torn down. In its place, a memorial garden was planned, a place for reflection, peace, and resilience. Kimberly Cates' legacy lived on in community service programs, fundraisers, and scholarships. Her name became synonymous with compassion. Today, Steven Spader remains in a maximum security unit. He's 30 years old now, having spent more of his life behind bars than in the free world. He's shown no real signs of change, no meaningful remorse. Occasionally, letters surface. Rarely, media outlets request interviews, all denied. The prison treats him as high risk, not just because of the crime, but because of how eagerly he still embraces it. He's been dubbed the boy who wanted to be a serial killer. But unlike many who seek that title, he never got a second chance, and he never will. Gribble continues to participate in prison programs. He attends religious groups and mentors other inmates. But those who work with him remain cautious. There's a clinical coldness about him, a feeling that everything is calculated. His psychiatric evaluations remain sealed, but most agree on one thing: he isn't insane. He's something far more terrifying aware. Gribble, like Spader, will never see freedom again. Kimberly wasn't famous. She wasn't a politician, celebrity, or powerful figure. But her death reshaped laws, families, and an entire state's consciousness. She was a mother, a friend, a community leader. And in her final act defending her daughter, she showed unimaginable courage. The town remembers her, not for how she died, but for how she lived. And her daughter, her living legacy, carries that story forward. On a quiet night in October 2009, evil broke into a home in Mount Vernon. It wielded a machete. It called itself the Disciples of Destruction. It thought it was unstoppable, but evil made a mistake. It left a witness, a fighter, a voice. Today, that voice still echoes, not from a place of vengeance, but from a place of strength. Jamie Cates lived. And through her story, Kimberly lives too. And Steven Spader? He sits in a concrete cell, forgotten, contained, powerless, because sometimes evil win.